3 days before Lauren Mitchell walked out of her husband's life, Ethan Mitchell learned that he was worth more than $8 billion. She didn't know. She couldn't have known. As far as Lauren was concerned, Ethan was a disabled man sitting alone in a quiet house, a man whose life had been destroyed by an accident and whose future seemed to be shrinking with every passing month. And on that cold morning, as Lauren carried the last of her belongings toward the front door, Ethan watched her leave without telling her the one thing that could have changed everything. He could have stopped her with a single sentence. He could have told her about the fortune. He could have told her that the man she believed had nothing left had just inherited one of the largest private fortunes in the country. But Ethan said nothing. Instead, he watched his wife of nearly 17 years place her hand on the door, take one final look back at him, and walk away. What Lauren didn't know was that the life she was leaving behind had already changed forever. And what Ethan didn't know was that the next few weeks would force him to discover whether Lauren had ever truly loved him, or whether the hardest years of their marriage had simply revealed something that had been hidden all along. Lauren had packed carefully. She hadn't wanted the scene to become dramatic. There were no screaming neighbors outside, no shattered plates, no accusations thrown across the room. Just two people standing in a house that had once been filled with laughter, now struggling to find anything left to say to each other. Ethan sat near the window in his wheelchair, watching Lauren move from room to room. She took her clothes first, then the photographs, then the small wooden box containing the jewelry Ethan had given her over the years. She stopped in the hallway when she reached the photograph from their wedding day. For a few seconds, she simply stared at it. In that photograph, Ethan was smiling. Lauren was smiling. Neither of them knew what was coming. Neither could have imagined that 17 years later, one of them would be leaving while the other secretly possessed a fortune measured in billions. Lauren placed the photograph into her suitcase. Ethan watched her do it. Then she looked directly at him and said something he would remember for the rest of his life. "Ethan, I can't keep living like this." There was no anger in his voice when he answered, "I know." Those two words surprised Lauren. She had expected an argument. She had expected Ethan to accuse her of abandoning him. She had expected him to remind her of all the promises they had made in the hospital, all the nights she had told him they would get through the accident together. But Ethan didn't fight her. He simply looked at the woman he had once believed would grow old beside him and realized that he had been preparing himself for this moment for months. Lauren picked up her bag. She walked toward the door. Then she stopped. "I'm sorry," she said. Ethan looked down at his hands. "I know." Lauren opened the door, and before she stepped outside, she asked him one final question. "What are you going to do now?" Ethan looked toward the window, then back at her. "I'm going to figure it out." Lauren nodded. Then she left. The door closed, and for several seconds, Ethan remained completely still. But there was something Lauren didn't know. Something Ethan had discovered only 72 hours earlier. Something his father, Charles Mitchell, had deliberately kept hidden from him for almost his entire life. 3 days before Lauren walked away, Ethan had sat across from an attorney named Jonathan Reed. Jonathan had spent years handling the private affairs of Charles Mitchell, and when he placed a thick folder on Ethan's table that morning, Ethan assumed it contained paperwork concerning his father's estate. Charles had died only weeks earlier, and Ethan believed the inheritance would be modest. Perhaps a property, perhaps some investments, perhaps enough money to make life a little easier. Ethan had never imagined what was inside that folder. Jonathan opened it slowly and pushed the first document across the table. Ethan read the number once. Then he read it again. Then a third time. He looked at Jonathan and asked if there had been a mistake. Jonathan shook his head. "There hasn't been a mistake, Ethan." Then he said the sentence that would divide Ethan's life into everything that came before and everything that came after. "Your father left you control of assets currently valued at approximately $8 billion. Ethan didn't speak. He couldn't. For years, Charles Mitchell had allowed his son to believe that the family was comfortable but ordinary. Charles had never bought Ethan extravagant gifts. He had never talked about private jets or luxury estates. He had never appeared on the covers of financial magazines. He had taught Ethan to work, to save, and to understand the value of an honest day's effort. Even after Charles became increasingly successful, he insisted that Ethan build his own career. Ethan had spent most of his adult life believing that his father's wealth was measured in millions. Now Jonathan Reed was telling him that the reality was measured in billions. The fortune wasn't sitting in a single bank account. It was spread across investments, companies, property holdings, trusts, and other assets Charles had carefully accumulated over decades. Ethan stared at the documents while Jonathan explained the structure. But Ethan barely heard him. His mind kept returning to one question. Why had his father hidden this from him? Jonathan eventually gave him an answer. Your father believed knowing about the money too early would change you. Ethan looked up. Change me? Jonathan nodded. Charles believed that if you knew what you would inherit, you might never discover who you were without it. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For years, he had thought his father was simply private. Now he wondered whether every lesson Charles had ever taught him had been part of a plan. And there was another detail Jonathan had not yet explained. Charles had anticipated that Ethan might one day face a serious personal crisis. He had created protections around the inheritance that would prevent people from gaining access to it simply because they were close to Ethan. Jonathan didn't say why at first, but Ethan would eventually understand. Charles had been thinking about something his son had never considered. What would happen if money suddenly entered a marriage that had already begun to break apart? That was the question Ethan carried with him when Lauren left. She believed she was walking away from a disabled husband whose future was uncertain. Ethan knew that his future was no longer uncertain financially. But money couldn't answer the question that mattered most. If Lauren had known about the inheritance, would she still have walked through that door? Ethan couldn't stop thinking about it. He remembered the early years of their marriage, when they had almost nothing. He remembered the tiny apartment they rented, the cheap vacations, the arguments over bills, the nights they laughed until they couldn't breathe. Back then, Lauren had loved him when there was nothing to gain. Or at least, Ethan believed she had. Then came the accident. Everything changed. And perhaps that was the real beginning of the story. Because the accident didn't just take away Ethan's ability to live the way he once had. It changed the balance inside his marriage. Lauren became his caregiver. Ethan became dependent on her. Love slowly became responsibility, and responsibility slowly became resentment. Neither of them knew that while their marriage was falling apart, Charles Mitchell's secret fortune was waiting in the background. And now Lauren was gone. Ethan remained alone in the house that afternoon. He looked around at the empty spaces where her belongings had been. On the kitchen counter was a mug she had forgotten to take. In the bedroom, one of her books was still sitting beside the lamp. On the refrigerator was an old photograph of the two of them from a summer they had spent near Lake Erie. Ethan stared at it for a long time. Then his phone rang. It was Jonathan Reed. Ethan answered. Jonathan asked whether Lauren knew about the inheritance. Ethan looked toward the closed front door. No, he said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Are you planning to tell her? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Then he said, I don't know. Jonathan warned him that once the inheritance became public, everything could change. Ethan already knew that. What he didn't know was how quickly that change was coming. Because somewhere in the financial world, people were beginning to discover that Charles Mitchell's estate was far larger than anyone had realized. And once the truth about Ethan's inheritance reached the outside world, Lauren would finally learn what the man she had walked away from was really worth. But by then, Ethan would have to make a decision that could not be undone. Would he give Lauren a second chance? Would he give her part of the fortune? Or would he finally accept that the woman who had walked away from him had already answered the most important question of all? Because Lauren hadn't left a billionaire. She had left Ethan. And Ethan was about to discover whether those were two very different things. To understand why Lauren Mitchell walked away from Ethan, you have to go back to a time when neither of them knew what the future had planned for them. Before the wheelchair. Before the lawyers. Before the $8 billion inheritance. Before Ethan Mitchell became the man whose name would eventually attract attention from people he had never met. There was a time when Ethan and Lauren were simply two people trying to build an ordinary American life. They didn't have private jets. They didn't own a mansion. They didn't spend their weekends surrounded by wealthy friends. In fact, there were years when they worried about the same things most couples worry about. Rent, bills, car repairs, unexpected expenses, whether they could afford to take a vacation that year. And yet, when Ethan looked back at those years, he would remember something money could never buy. Back then, Lauren had looked at him as if he were enough. Ethan believed that was what love was supposed to look like. They met at a community charity event in Columbus, Ohio, when Ethan was 30 and Lauren was 26. Ethan had gone because a friend convinced him to volunteer for the weekend. Lauren had gone because her sister was helping organize the event. Neither of them expected to meet the person they would eventually marry. Their first conversation was almost forgettable. They talked about the weather. They joked about the terrible coffee being served at the event. Lauren teased Ethan because he had somehow managed to spill coffee on his own sleeve before the event had even started. Ethan laughed. They talked again the following weekend. Then again a few days later. Eventually, the casual conversations became phone calls. The phone calls became dinners. The dinners became weekends together. And before either of them realized what was happening, Ethan had begun imagining a future with her. Lauren felt the same way. They weren't drawn together by wealth or status. Ethan had neither. Lauren wasn't looking for either. They were simply young, hopeful, and convinced that if they worked hard enough, they could build something that belonged entirely to them. Ethan proposed after 2 years of dating. He didn't rent a helicopter. He didn't take Lauren to an expensive restaurant. He took her to a small park where they had spent one of their earliest dates. He had bought a simple ring and spent most of the afternoon worrying that he would somehow ruin the moment. Lauren later told her friends that she knew he was nervous the second she saw him. Ethan could barely finish his sentence. Lauren didn't make him finish. She said yes before he had even reached the question. Their wedding was modest. Family members filled the room. Friends gave speeches. Ethan's father, Charles Mitchell, sat quietly near the front. Charles was proud of his son, but there was something about him that Ethan didn't fully understand. Charles rarely talked about money. He never discussed his investments with Ethan. He didn't talk about the companies he owned or the properties he had acquired. If Ethan asked how business was going, Charles would usually smile and say, "Things are fine." Ethan assumed that was simply his father's personality. Private, careful, reserved. He had no idea that Charles was already sitting on a financial empire that would eventually change his son's life. For the first few years of their marriage, Ethan and Lauren lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Columbus. The building wasn't impressive. The kitchen was cramped. The heating system had a habit of making strange noises during winter. Their neighbors were close enough that Ethan could sometimes hear arguments through the walls. But they loved the place. They built their routine around it. Ethan worked during the week. Lauren worked as well, and together they saved what they could. On Friday evenings, they sometimes ordered takeout and watched old movies. On Saturdays, they went grocery shopping together. They talked about buying a house someday. They talked about having children, although life kept getting in the way. Most importantly, they believed they were moving forward. Ethan had started building a logistics company with 2 friends, and although the business was nowhere near becoming a major corporation, it was growing. Ethan was proud of it. For the first time in his life, he felt that he was creating something without his father's help. But Charles Mitchell was watching from a distance. He knew more about his son's future than Ethan could possibly imagine. Charles knew that his investments were becoming extraordinarily valuable. He knew that some of the companies he had invested in were expanding rapidly. He knew that properties he had purchased years earlier were now worth many times what he had paid. Yet he deliberately kept Ethan away from the details. There was a reason. Charles had watched wealthy families destroy themselves before. He had seen children inherit money and lose their ambition. He had watched marriages collapse because one person suddenly gained financial power over the other. He had seen relatives who had never spoken for years appear overnight when an inheritance became available. Charles didn't want that life for Ethan. He wanted his son to learn what it meant to build a life before learning what it meant to inherit one. There was another reason Charles was so cautious. Years earlier, one of his closest business associates had lost almost everything because someone close to him discovered the size of his fortune. Charles never forgot what happened afterward. Friends became creditors. Relatives became competitors. People who had ignored the man for decades suddenly wanted to know him. Charles watched the situation unfold and came to a conclusion that would eventually shape Ethan's entire future. Money didn't necessarily change people. Sometimes, money simply revealed them. And Charles wanted Ethan to know who the people around him really were before the family fortune became part of his life. So Charles made a decision. He would keep the true size of his wealth hidden from Ethan until the day Ethan absolutely needed to know. He created trusts. He separated assets. He placed investments into structures that would make the family's true financial position difficult to understand from the outside. And he told only a handful of people what the estate was really worth. One of those people was Jonathan Reed. Another was David Parker. Jonathan was the attorney who had handled Charles's private legal affairs for years. David was the family accountant, a quiet and methodical man who had spent decades tracking Charles's investments. Together, the two men knew the truth. They knew that Charles wasn't simply a successful businessman. They knew his holdings had grown into something extraordinary. But they also knew Charles had given them strict instructions. Ethan was not to be told unless circumstances required it. And then, one day, those circumstances would arrive. For Ethan and Lauren, however, life continued normally. They eventually bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Ethan was proud of the purchase. It wasn't luxurious, but it was theirs. Lauren decorated the living room herself. Ethan spent an entire weekend assembling furniture that should have taken 2 hours. They laughed about it afterward. There were arguments, of course. Every marriage has them. Sometimes they argued about money. Sometimes about work. Sometimes about Ethan spending too much time at his company. Lauren occasionally complained that Ethan was never home. Ethan occasionally complained that Lauren expected too much from him. But they always came back to each other. At least, that's how Ethan remembered it. There were no obvious signs that their marriage was headed toward disaster. If anything, the opposite seemed true. When Charles visited, he often watched the couple quietly and appeared satisfied. But there was one thing he noticed that Ethan didn't. Lauren had begun asking questions about Charles's business. At first, the questions seemed harmless. Lauren wanted to know what Charles actually did. Ethan would tell her that his father had investments and owned several properties. She asked whether Charles was wealthy. Ethan shrugged. He's comfortable. Lauren laughed at the word. Comfortable, she asked. Your father owns half the buildings in this city. Ethan laughed and told her she was exaggerating. She wasn't. But Ethan didn't know that. To him, his father was simply a successful older businessman who had always lived below his means. Charles drove an older luxury sedan. He wore expensive suits, but never flashy ones. He lived in a beautiful house, but never spoke about its value. He didn't travel with an entourage. He didn't behave like a billionaire. And because Charles never displayed the wealth, Ethan never thought to question how much of it actually existed. Then came the accident. It happened on a rainy evening when Ethan was driving home. The road was slick. Visibility was poor. A vehicle traveling in the opposite direction crossed the center line. Ethan had only seconds to react. He tried to avoid the collision, but there was nowhere to go. The impact was violent enough to destroy both vehicles. Emergency crews arrived quickly. Ethan was trapped inside the wreckage. By the time they pulled him out, he had suffered injuries that would permanently alter his life. Lauren received the phone call that night. She drove to the hospital believing she might never see her husband alive again. Doctors worked for hours. Ethan survived, but survival was only the beginning. When Lauren finally saw him, he was unconscious, surrounded by machines. She stood beside his hospital bed and held his hand. She told him that she was there. She told him he wasn't going to face this alone. And for a while, she meant every word. The months that followed tested them in ways neither had anticipated. Ethan went through rehabilitation. He had to relearn how to perform basic tasks. Things he had once done without thinking became exhausting. Getting dressed took longer. Moving from one place to another required assistance. His independence disappeared piece by piece. Lauren became the person he depended on most. She helped him get to appointments. She managed medications. She prepared meals. She dealt with insurance companies. She learned how to operate equipment inside the house. And at first, she didn't complain. When friends asked how she was coping, she told them Ethan was going to get better. She believed that if they worked hard enough, life would eventually return to normal. But there was no return to the old normal. That was the part neither of them understood. Ethan's injury wasn't temporary. His doctors eventually explained that he would have permanent limitations. He could still live a meaningful life, but it would be different from the life he had imagined. Ethan struggled with that reality. He became quieter. He stopped talking about expanding his business. He stopped making long-term plans. Sometimes he sat alone for hours, staring through the window. Lauren tried to encourage him, but eventually her encouragement became frustration. She wanted the old Ethan back. Ethan wanted the old Ethan back too. But neither of them could bring him back. The first real argument came one evening when Lauren returned from work exhausted. Ethan had needed help with something during the day, and Lauren had rearranged her schedule to come home early. When she walked through the door, she expected Ethan to understand how difficult her day had been. Instead, Ethan asked why she was late. Lauren stared at him. It was a small question, but after months of pressure, it felt enormous. She told him she was tired. Ethan apologized. Lauren said she didn't want another apology. Then she said something that neither of them would forget. "I don't know how long I can keep doing this." Ethan went silent. Lauren immediately regretted saying it. She tried to explain that she was overwhelmed. Ethan told her he understood. But something had changed. For the first time, both of them understood that love alone might not be enough to carry them through what was coming. And while Ethan struggled to rebuild his life, Charles Mitchell was becoming increasingly concerned. He knew his son's condition was serious. He also knew something Ethan didn't. Charles had already begun making changes to the estate. Jonathan Reed had been instructed to review every trust. David Parker had been asked to calculate the value of the family's holdings. Charles wanted everything ready. If something happened to him, Ethan was supposed to be protected. But Charles wasn't only thinking about death. He was thinking about his son's vulnerability. Ethan was now disabled. He depended on others for certain aspects of his life. Charles feared that if his wealth became known too soon, people might approach Ethan for the wrong reasons. So he strengthened the protections around the inheritance. Then, several months after Ethan's accident, Charles called Jonathan. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. When it ended, Jonathan understood that Charles had made a decision. He wanted the estate finalized. He wanted Ethan protected, and he wanted one final condition included. Ethan was not to receive control of the fortune until certain legal requirements had been satisfied. Charles believed there was still time. There wasn't. Not long afterward, Charles Mitchell died. Ethan was devastated. His father had been one of the few people who never treated him like a broken man after the accident. Charles never looked at him with pity. He always spoke to him as if Ethan's future still mattered. At the funeral, Ethan believed he was saying goodbye to the man who had raised him. He didn't know he was also standing beside the inheritance that would soon make him one of the richest men in America. And Lauren didn't know either. At that moment, she was still standing beside Ethan, still helping him, still telling people she loved him. But the marriage was changing, and somewhere inside the legal machinery Charles had left behind, Jonathan Reed was preparing a folder that contained a number so large Ethan would initially believe it was a mistake. $8 billion. A fortune Charles had spent decades building. A fortune Ethan never knew existed. A fortune that would soon force Ethan to question every relationship in his life, including his marriage. Because the greatest secret in Ethan Mitchell's life wasn't that his father was rich. It was that Charles had deliberately kept Ethan poor in knowledge so he could find out who would remain beside him when there was nothing to gain. And now, with Charles gone and Ethan's marriage already under strain, that test was about to begin. There are moments in a person's life when everything changes in a matter of seconds. For Ethan Mitchell, that moment came on a rainy evening when he was driving home from work. He had no reason to believe the night would be different from any other night. He had spoken to Lauren earlier that evening. They had discussed dinner. Ethan remembered telling her he would be home soon. It was an ordinary conversation between two married people who had spent years learning each other's routines. But as Ethan drove along the wet highway, another vehicle suddenly crossed into his lane. The headlights appeared through the rain. Ethan reacted instinctively. He turned the steering wheel and tried to avoid the collision. There was almost no time. The impact came with tremendous force. Metal folded. Glass shattered. The vehicle spun across the wet road. And within seconds, the ordinary life Ethan had spent years building was gone. Emergency crews arrived to find Ethan trapped inside the wreckage. Rain continued falling as firefighters worked to free him. The details of the crash would later become part of an official report, but for Lauren, none of those details mattered that night. All she knew was that her husband had been seriously injured. She drove to the hospital without knowing whether Ethan would survive. When she finally reached the emergency department, doctors were still working on him. Lauren stood in a hospital corridor with her hands shaking, trying to call Ethan's family. Then she called Charles Mitchell. Charles answered almost immediately. Lauren told him there had been an accident. For several seconds, Charles said nothing. Then he asked which hospital. Lauren gave him the name. Charles told her he was coming. Neither of them knew that before the night was over, Charles would make a decision that would eventually become one of the most important decisions in Ethan's life. Ethan survived the initial surgery, but survival was only the beginning. His injuries were severe. The doctors explained that he had suffered permanent damage that would affect his mobility for the rest of his life. Lauren listened to the doctors explain what rehabilitation would involve, but she struggled to understand what their words really meant. She kept asking whether Ethan would walk again. She asked whether the doctors were certain. She asked whether another operation could change the outcome. The answers became increasingly difficult to hear. Ethan's condition had stabilized, but his life would never return to what it had been before the crash. When Lauren finally entered his hospital room, Ethan was unconscious. Machines monitored his condition. His face looked different to her, not because he had changed, but because she had never seen the man she loved surrounded by so much medical equipment. Lauren took his hand and whispered that she was there. She promised him he wasn't going to face this alone. For the first several months, Lauren kept that promise. She became the person Ethan depended on most. She learned how to help him transfer from one place to another. She learned his medication schedule. She attended rehabilitation sessions. She spoke with doctors and insurance representatives. She brought his favorite meals to the hospital when he was finally able to eat normally. When friends asked how she was doing, Lauren smiled and told them they were taking things one day at a time. She didn't tell them how frightened she was. She didn't tell them that she sometimes sat in her car outside the hospital because she needed a few minutes alone before going inside. She didn't tell them that she missed the life they had before the accident. And she certainly didn't tell Ethan how often she wondered whether she had the strength to spend the rest of her life as his caregiver. Ethan was struggling too, but his struggle looked different. Before the accident, he had been independent. He had built a business. He drove himself everywhere. He fixed things around the house. He made plans without asking anyone for help. Now he needed assistance with things he had once taken for granted. Someone had to help him get dressed. Someone had to help him move safely. Someone had to drive him to appointments. The smallest tasks could become exhausting. Ethan hated asking for help. Every time he needed Lauren, he felt as though another piece of his independence had disappeared. At first, he tried to hide his frustration. He made jokes. He told Lauren he was fine. But eventually the jokes stopped. Ethan became quieter. He started spending long periods looking through the window. He wasn't angry at Lauren. He was angry at the life that had been taken from him. The rehabilitation process was slow. There were good days and bad days. On the good days, Ethan believed he could still build a meaningful future. On the bad days, he questioned whether anything would ever feel normal again. Lauren celebrated every small improvement. When Ethan managed something by himself, she smiled. When he struggled, she encouraged him. But the longer the rehabilitation continued, the more complicated their relationship became. Lauren wanted Ethan to keep fighting. Ethan sometimes wanted her to stop telling him to fight. He didn't want motivational speeches. He wanted someone to acknowledge that he was grieving. He was grieving the person he had been. He was grieving the future he had imagined. And sometimes, the person closest to him was the person who reminded him most painfully of what he had lost. One evening, Lauren came into Ethan's hospital room after a particularly difficult day. Ethan had failed to complete an exercise he had managed the previous week. He was frustrated. Lauren tried to encourage him. Ethan told her he was tired. Lauren told him everyone was tired. Ethan looked at her and asked whether she understood what it felt like to wake up every morning knowing that the rest of your life would be different. Lauren didn't answer immediately. Then she said something she would later regret. "You can't give up." Ethan looked away. He told her he wasn't giving up. He was simply exhausted. Lauren became emotional. She told him she was exhausted too. For the first time, the two of them stopped pretending everything was going to be okay. They both cried. They both apologized. And they both promised to keep trying. But promises made under pressure can become difficult to keep. When Ethan eventually returned home, the house had been modified for his needs. Ramps were installed. Furniture was rearranged. The bathroom was changed. The bedroom was reorganized. The place that had once represented freedom now felt like a reminder of everything Ethan could no longer do. Lauren tried to make the house comfortable. She bought equipment. She reorganized cabinets. She prepared meals. She created schedules. She did everything she could think of. Ethan appreciated it, but gratitude became complicated. The more Lauren did for him, the more dependent he felt. And the more dependent Ethan became, the more pressure Lauren carried. At first, their friends believed the two of them were doing remarkably well. They saw Lauren helping Ethan and assumed that was what commitment looked like. They saw Ethan smiling and assumed he was adjusting. But inside the house, a different story was developing. Lauren was tired. Ethan was ashamed. Neither wanted to admit how much resentment was beginning to enter their marriage. They began arguing over small things. Why hadn't Ethan called when he needed something? Why had Lauren stayed late at work? Why did Ethan expect her to rearrange everything around his schedule? Why did Lauren make him feel like a burden? Neither question had an easy answer. Both had legitimate feelings. And because neither knew how to solve them, the distance between them grew. Meanwhile, Charles Mitchell was watching closely. He visited Ethan often, but he never treated him like a helpless man. Charles would sit beside his son and talk about business, politics, sports, and ordinary things. He refused to let every conversation become about the accident. Ethan appreciated that. One afternoon, Charles asked Ethan what he wanted to do once rehabilitation was over. Ethan laughed and said he didn't know. Charles told him that not knowing was acceptable. Then Charles said something Ethan would remember later. Your life isn't over because it changed. Ethan didn't understand how important those words were at the time. Charles did. He knew his son's life was about to change again, but for an entirely different reason. Charles had begun preparing the estate. Jonathan Reed had already reviewed the trusts. David Parker had begun updating financial valuations. Investments were being reorganized. Ownership structures were being reviewed. Charles wanted everything in order. He knew his health was becoming more fragile, and he didn't want to leave unfinished business behind. But there was one concern that occupied him more than the financial details. He wanted to protect Ethan from people who might see his disability as an opportunity. Charles had spent decades learning that wealth attracted attention. Now his son was vulnerable in a way he had never been before. Charles feared that if the family fortune became public, Ethan might be surrounded by people claiming to care about him while actually caring about his money. Charles never told Ethan the full truth. That decision became harder after Ethan's accident. One afternoon, Charles sat privately with Jonathan Reed. He asked the attorney whether the estate was protected. Jonathan told him that the legal structures were strong. Charles asked whether Ethan's future spouse could gain control of the assets. Jonathan explained the protections that had already been established. Charles listened carefully. Then he asked another question. And if Ethan's marriage ends? Jonathan paused. He explained that the trusts had been designed to protect the inherited assets under specific circumstances. Charles nodded. He wasn't predicting that Ethan and Lauren would separate. At least, he didn't say that he was. But he understood something that Ethan didn't. Marriage can change when circumstances change. And Ethan's circumstances had changed dramatically. For a while, Charles hoped things would improve. He believed Lauren was simply exhausted. He believed Ethan was still adjusting. He believed time might give them both perspective. But during one of his visits, Charles noticed something that concerned him. Ethan was sitting quietly near the window while Lauren was in another room. Charles asked his son how things were going. Ethan hesitated. Then he said, "We're trying." Charles knew that phrase. It was what people said when something was already becoming difficult. Charles asked whether Ethan was happy. Ethan didn't answer. Charles didn't push him. Several weeks later, Charles became seriously ill. Ethan wanted to visit him, but his own medical schedule made travel difficult. They spoke by telephone instead. Charles told his son that he loved him. Ethan told his father the same thing. There was nothing dramatic about the conversation. No grand farewell. No final revelation. Just a father and son talking. Charles told Ethan to trust himself. Ethan asked what he meant. Charles said, "You'll understand when the time comes." Ethan laughed and told him he was being cryptic again. Charles laughed too. That was the last ordinary conversation they would ever have. Charles Mitchell died shortly afterward. The news devastated Ethan. Lauren was beside him at the funeral. She held his arm as they stood among family and friends. Ethan looked at the casket and struggled to accept that his father was gone. Charles had been distant in some ways, but he had always been there when Ethan needed him. Ethan remembered his father's advice. He remembered the quiet conversations. He remembered the way Charles refused to pity him after the accident. And as the funeral ended, Ethan believed the hardest part of his life was already happening. He was wrong, because 6 weeks after the funeral, a letter arrived. It wasn't from a friend. It wasn't from a bank. It wasn't from an insurance company. It was from Jonathan Reed. The letter contained only a request for Ethan to meet him privately. Ethan assumed it was ordinary estate paperwork. Lauren assumed the same. Neither of them knew that Jonathan was preparing to tell Ethan the secret Charles had protected for decades. When Ethan arrived at Jonathan's office, David Parker was already there. The accountant looked unusually serious. Jonathan closed the office door. He placed a thick black folder on the desk. Then he told Ethan that before his father died, Charles had left very specific instructions. Ethan asked what was inside the folder, and that secret would force Ethan to look at his marriage in an entirely different way. Ethan Mitchell stared at the document in front of him as if the number might change if he looked at it long enough. $8 billion. His mind refused to accept it. He looked at Jonathan Reed, waiting for the attorney to smile and admit that there had been some kind of mistake. Jonathan didn't smile. David Parker didn't either. Both men simply watched Ethan as he tried to understand what his father had been hiding from him for decades. Ethan finally looked down at the document again. How? He asked. Jonathan folded his hands on the desk. Your father built it over a very long period of time. Ethan shook his head. My father wasn't worth $8 billion. David Parker finally spoke. He didn't want anyone to know. Ethan looked at him. Not even me. David lowered his eyes for a moment. Especially not you. That answer hurt more than the number itself. Ethan had spent his entire adult life believing he knew his father. Now, sitting inside a law office surrounded by documents he barely understood, he realized there had been an entire side of Charles Mitchell's life that his own son had never been allowed to see. Jonathan opened another folder. He explained that Charles had never held the fortune in one obvious place. There was no enormous bank account with $8 billion sitting untouched. The wealth had been accumulated through decades of investments, private companies, commercial properties, energy interests, transportation holdings, and carefully structured financial vehicles. Some assets were held directly. Others were controlled through trusts and investment entities. Some had been acquired long before Ethan was born. Others had increased dramatically in value during the years Ethan and Lauren were struggling to pay ordinary household expenses. Ethan listened in silence. He had spent years believing that his father's success was comfortable but modest. He remembered Charles driving the same kind of car for years. He remembered his father's habit of wearing old watches and buying practical clothes. Charles had never behaved like someone with billions. That had been intentional. He wanted his son to believe that hard work mattered more than money. Ethan finally understood that the modest lifestyle had been part of the disguise. Jonathan then explained why the estate had been structured so carefully. Charles knew that an inheritance of this size could attract attention from almost anyone. Relatives might appear. Old friends could return. Business associates might suddenly become interested in Ethan. People who had never called him before might suddenly want to become part of his life. Charles had watched wealthy families deal with exactly that problem. He had seen people lose fortunes because they trusted the wrong person. He had seen marriages become financial battles. He had seen children who inherited wealth before developing a sense of responsibility become incapable of managing it. Charles wanted to avoid all of those possibilities with Ethan, so he created layers of protection around the estate. Ethan would inherit the economic benefit, but control would be carefully transferred. Jonathan would oversee the legal process. David would monitor the financial side, and Ethan would have time to understand what had happened before making any major decisions. Ethan asked the question that had been sitting inside him since he opened the folder. Why didn't he tell me? Jonathan looked at him for several seconds. Your father believed that if you knew the money was waiting for you, you would never know whether the life you built was actually yours. Ethan looked away. Jonathan continued. Charles had deliberately wanted Ethan to experience ordinary life. He wanted him to work for his own success. He wanted Ethan to choose his friends and his wife without thinking about money. He wanted his son to learn what it meant to lose something and rebuild it. The inheritance was never supposed to be a shortcut. It was supposed to be something Ethan received after he had already become the person Charles wanted him to become. Ethan didn't know whether to be angry or grateful. His father had protected him from the fortune, but he had also kept a huge part of the truth from him. Then Ethan asked about Lauren. The room became quiet. Jonathan knew exactly why Ethan was asking. Does Lauren have any idea about this? Ethan asked. Jonathan shook his head. Not from us. Ethan leaned back in his wheelchair. He looked toward the window. Outside, people were walking along the sidewalk. Cars moved through the street. Nobody outside that office knew what had just happened. Ethan had entered the building as a man trying to understand his father's estate. He was leaving with the knowledge that his financial life had changed beyond recognition. But his emotional life was still exactly where it had been that morning. Lauren was at home. Their marriage was strained. She was exhausted. Ethan was dependent on her. And neither of them knew that a fortune worth approximately $8 billion had just entered the picture. Jonathan warned Ethan that the information could not remain secret forever. The estate would eventually require public filings. Some ownership transfers would become visible. Financial institutions would know. Business partners would know. Lawyers would know. Eventually, journalists might discover the size of the fortune. Ethan asked how long they had. Jonathan said it depended on how quickly the estate was transferred and whether any information became public earlier. Ethan didn't like the answer. He wanted time. He wanted to understand what his father had left him before anyone else knew. Most importantly, he wanted to know what the money would do to the people around him. David Parker then handed Ethan another document. It wasn't a valuation. It was a letter from Charles. Ethan recognized his father's handwriting immediately. His hands began to shake. Jonathan told him that Charles had written the letter shortly before his death. It was meant for Ethan to read only after the inheritance was formally transferred. Ethan opened it slowly. The letter didn't begin with money. Charles didn't mention billions. He didn't mention companies or investments. He talked about Ethan's childhood. He talked about the first time Ethan rode a bicycle. He remembered Ethan's stubbornness as a teenager. He remembered the day Ethan started his first business. Then Charles wrote about the accident. Ethan stopped reading. For several seconds, he couldn't continue. Charles had known that Ethan was struggling. He had known his son felt ashamed of needing help. He had known Ethan believed his life had become smaller. And Charles wanted him to understand something. The accident had taken away certain abilities, but it had not taken away Ethan's value. Charles told his son that wealth should never become the measure of a person's worth. He warned him that the fortune could make people see him differently. But Ethan had to remember that he was still the same man who had built a life before the money arrived. Ethan wiped his eyes. Then he reached the final paragraph. Charles had written that there was one thing he hoped Ethan would never do. He hoped Ethan would never use money to make someone love him. Ethan stared at that sentence. He read it again, then a third time, and suddenly, the inheritance no longer felt like a gift. It felt like a test. When Ethan returned home that evening, Lauren was in the kitchen. She asked how the meeting had gone. Ethan told her it was complicated. She asked whether there were problems with the estate. Ethan said no. Lauren asked whether Charles had left him anything. Ethan paused. Some things, he said. Lauren looked at him. Like what? Ethan answered that there were some investments and property interests. It wasn't a lie. It simply wasn't the truth. Lauren accepted the answer. Then she asked Ethan whether he wanted dinner. For a moment, Ethan almost told her everything. He imagined saying the words out loud. Lauren, my father left me $8 billion. He imagined the expression on her face. Would she be shocked? Would she laugh? Would she cry? Would she ask questions? Would she hug him? Would she suddenly become hopeful about their marriage? Or would something change between them that could never be changed back? Ethan decided not to tell her. That night, after Lauren went to bed, Ethan remained awake. He stared into the darkness. He thought about his father's letter. He thought about the accident. He thought about the woman sleeping in the next room. And he wondered whether Charles had known this exact moment would come. Meanwhile, Lauren was experiencing her own private conflict. She loved Ethan. At least, part of her still did. But she was exhausted. She missed the man he had been before the accident. She missed spontaneous weekends. She missed traveling. She missed being able to make plans without calculating whether Ethan could participate. She missed having a husband who didn't need assistance with so many things. And she hated herself for thinking those thoughts. Sometimes she looked at Ethan and felt love. Other times she looked at him and felt trapped. That contradiction terrified her. She began spending more time away from home. She worked longer hours. She visited friends. She found reasons to stay out. Ethan noticed. He didn't accuse her of anything. He simply became quieter. One evening, Lauren came home late. Ethan asked where she had been. She said she had been with a friend. Ethan asked whether everything was okay. Lauren said she was fine. Ethan knew she wasn't. He asked whether she was unhappy with him. Lauren didn't answer. That silence told him more than words could have. The next morning, Ethan called Jonathan. He asked whether Lauren could ever have a claim on the inheritance if their marriage ended. Jonathan explained that the trusts had been designed to protect the inherited assets, but family law could still become complicated depending on circumstances and jurisdiction. Ethan didn't want to know how to keep Lauren from getting money. He wanted to know whether telling her about the inheritance would change the legal situation. Jonathan warned him that once the secret was revealed, there would be no way to put it back. Ethan understood. He asked Jonathan to keep everything confidential. Jonathan agreed. But David Parker had another concern. He had been reviewing activity around the estate. Somebody had begun asking questions. Not about Ethan personally, about Charles Mitchell, about his companies, about the estate. David couldn't yet determine who was making the inquiries, but someone was beginning to look. That meant Ethan's secret had a clock attached to it, and Ethan didn't know how much time he had. Over the next several weeks, he began learning what his father had actually built. Jonathan introduced him to financial managers. David showed him portfolios. Ethan learned that Charles had invested in companies Ethan had heard of but never associated with his father. He learned that Charles owned commercial properties in multiple states. He learned about private investments Ethan had never imagined. He discovered that his father's wealth had grown quietly for decades while Charles continued living as though he were simply a successful businessman. The numbers became difficult for Ethan to process. One investment was worth hundreds of millions. Another had multiplied several times over. Some properties generated enormous annual income. There were trusts Ethan had never heard of, accounts he didn't recognize, companies he didn't know existed. It felt less like receiving an inheritance and more like discovering an entire hidden civilization that had been operating underneath his ordinary life. But Ethan didn't change his lifestyle. He kept the same house. He kept the same wheelchair. He kept the same vehicle. He didn't tell his friends. He didn't buy anything extravagant. Jonathan asked him why. Ethan said he wanted to know what his life looked like before deciding what his life should look like afterward. That answer impressed Jonathan. But Ethan had another reason. He wanted to know who would stay. He began observing people differently. When friends called, he noticed what they asked about. When relatives visited, he paid attention to what interested them. When Lauren talked about their future, he listened carefully. He wasn't trying to trap anyone. He wasn't setting a test. He simply wanted to understand whether the relationships around him were built on love or convenience. Then something happened that Ethan hadn't expected. Lauren began talking about leaving. It started with one sentence. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." Ethan looked at her. He had heard it before. But this time, there was something different in her voice. There was finality. Ethan asked whether she wanted a divorce. Lauren started crying. She told him she didn't know. She said she felt guilty. She said she loved him but wasn't sure she could spend the rest of her life living as his caregiver. Ethan listened. He wanted to tell her about the inheritance. He wanted to tell her that they would never have to worry about money again. He wanted to tell her that he could hire the best caregivers in the country. He wanted to tell her that they could travel again. He wanted to tell her that the future she thought had disappeared might actually be waiting for them. But Charles's final words stopped him. Never use money to make someone love you. So Ethan said nothing. Lauren went to bed that night believing her husband was financially ordinary. She believed they were facing an uncertain future. She believed leaving Ethan meant leaving behind a difficult marriage and a financially limited life. She had no idea that Ethan could afford almost anything she could imagine. And Ethan had no idea that within days, the secret he was protecting would begin moving beyond his control. Because David Parker had discovered the first serious sign that someone outside the family knew Charles Mitchell's estate was much larger than it appeared. Someone had begun tracing the ownership of the companies. Someone was asking questions about the trusts. And someone was getting closer to Ethan. The secret that Charles had protected for decades was beginning to leak. And when that secret finally reached the outside world, Lauren would discover something she had never imagined. The man she was thinking about leaving wasn't simply a disabled husband struggling to rebuild his life. He was the heir to a fortune worth approximately $8 billion. But by the time Lauren learned the truth, she would already have made her decision. And Ethan would have to decide whether he could forgive her for it. The first person to realize that Charles Mitchell's fortune might no longer remain a secret was David Parker. He had spent years working quietly behind the scenes, maintaining financial records that almost nobody outside Charles's inner circle knew existed. David wasn't accustomed to making dramatic conclusions. He dealt in numbers, contracts, and documented transactions. But the pattern appearing in front of him was difficult to ignore. Someone had begun looking into several companies connected to Charles. At first, David assumed it was routine. Large estates attracted lawyers, accountants, and financial institutions. But then the same names began appearing across different inquiries. Someone wasn't simply examining the estate. Someone was trying to understand who controlled it. And more importantly, someone appeared to be trying to determine who would eventually inherit it. David immediately contacted Jonathan Reed. When Jonathan arrived at the office, David placed the documents in front of him and said, "I think somebody knows." Jonathan asked the question that mattered most. "Knows what?" David looked at him. That Charles left Ethan everything. Jonathan understood the danger immediately. Until that moment, the inheritance had existed inside a carefully controlled legal structure. The people who knew about it could be counted on one hand. Ethan knew. Jonathan knew. David knew. A small number of financial institutions knew. But if someone outside that circle had started connecting the companies, trusts, and properties, the secret could spread quickly. Jonathan asked David whether Ethan's name had appeared in any of the inquiries. David said no. That was the only good news. The investigators appeared to be following Charles's financial trail rather than Ethan personally. Jonathan told David to increase security around the estate records. He also told him not to contact Ethan through ordinary channels about anything sensitive. They couldn't risk creating a trail. Meanwhile, Ethan remained unaware that his father's secret was beginning to attract attention. He was still focused on something far more personal, his marriage. Lauren had become increasingly distant. She wasn't cruel to Ethan. That was what made the situation so painful. She still helped him when he needed assistance. She still prepared meals. She still attended certain appointments. But the warmth between them had changed. Conversations became shorter. Silence filled the spaces where laughter used to be. Lauren began spending more time away from home. Ethan noticed every detail. He noticed when she stopped asking about his rehabilitation. He noticed when she stopped talking about future plans. He noticed when she began keeping her phone close to her. He noticed when she started saying she needed space. None of these things proved anything by themselves. Ethan knew that. But together, they created a picture he couldn't ignore. His wife was unhappy, and Ethan had a terrible suspicion that she had already begun imagining a life without him. One Friday evening, Lauren came home later than usual. Ethan was sitting in the living room when she entered. She put her keys down and noticed him watching her. "You're still awake," she said. Ethan nodded. He asked how her day had been. Lauren said it was fine. Ethan waited. Then he asked whether she was happy. Lauren froze. She didn't expect the question. She asked what he meant. Ethan told her he knew things between them had changed. Lauren sat down across from him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then she admitted that she didn't know what she wanted anymore. Ethan asked whether she still loved him. Lauren began crying. She said that love wasn't the only issue. She said their lives had become completely different. She said she felt like a caregiver instead of a wife. Ethan listened without interrupting. Every word hurt, but he didn't argue. He knew that if he told her about the inheritance now, he could change the entire conversation with a single sentence. Instead, he said, "If you want to leave, I'll understand." Lauren looked at him as though she hadn't expected that answer. She asked whether he was serious. Ethan said yes. But what Lauren didn't know was that Ethan wasn't offering her freedom because he had nothing left to give. He was offering it because his father had given him enough money to ensure that he would never have to use money as a weapon. Ethan could have told her that their financial problems were over. He could have promised her a completely different life. He could have offered luxury, travel, and security. But he knew that if Lauren stayed because of those things, he would never know whether she had chosen him or the fortune. The following morning, Lauren packed a small overnight bag. She told Ethan she needed a few days away. Ethan nodded. He didn't stop her. Lauren stood near the front door for a long time. Part of her seemed to expect him to ask her to stay. He didn't. Finally, she walked outside. Ethan watched through the window as she drove away. For the first time since the accident, he was completely alone. But he wasn't completely powerless. He called Jonathan. He asked whether he could access enough of the inheritance to arrange professional care. Jonathan said yes. Ethan told him to begin the process. Then Ethan asked another question. "Can you find out who is investigating my father?" Jonathan paused. He said he would try. That was the moment Ethan stopped being simply the heir who had unexpectedly discovered his fortune. He began taking control of his own story. Within days, Ethan moved into a private rehabilitation facility where he could receive specialized care without depending on Lauren. He hired professional assistants. He began working with therapists again. He also began studying his father's businesses. For the first time, he wanted to understand what Charles had built. And the more he learned, the more complicated the inheritance became. Charles hadn't simply left Ethan money. He had left him responsibilities. There were employees who depended on the companies. There were business partners. There were contracts. There were properties. There were investors. There were people whose livelihoods were connected to decisions Ethan had never known he would have to make. Jonathan warned him that inheriting wealth was one thing. Managing it was something else entirely. Ethan agreed. He wanted to learn. But while Ethan was learning about the fortune, Lauren was learning something else. She had begun speaking with friends about leaving the marriage. One friend told her she deserved a life that wasn't defined by caregiving. Another told her that Ethan would probably be better off with professional help. Lauren knew both statements contained some truth, but there was something she couldn't admit. She felt guilty. She remembered the hospital. She remembered promising Ethan that she would never leave him. She remembered holding his hand when he couldn't even speak. She remembered believing that their marriage could survive anything. And now she was considering walking away. The guilt made the decision harder. Then an opportunity appeared. Lauren was offered a position in another city. It was a significant career opportunity. For the first time in years, she saw a possible escape from the life she felt trapped inside. She told Ethan about it. Ethan congratulated her. She looked surprised. She had expected an argument. Instead, Ethan said she should take the opportunity if it was what she wanted. Lauren asked whether he would be okay. Ethan said he would manage. He didn't tell her that his father had left him enough money to ensure he could hire the best professional support available. He didn't tell her that his financial future was already secure. And he didn't tell her that he had begun building a life that no longer depended on her. Lauren left. At first, it was supposed to be temporary. But days became weeks. Calls became less frequent. Eventually, Lauren told Ethan that she wanted a divorce. Ethan was sitting alone in his apartment when she said it. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he remembered the woman he had married. He remembered their first apartment, their wedding, the house, the years before the accident. He remembered Lauren holding his hand in the hospital. And he remembered his father's warning. Never use money to make someone love you. Ethan told Lauren he would not fight her. She began crying. She asked whether he hated her. Ethan said no. He told her he didn't hate her, but he also didn't ask her to come back. That decision would later become important. Because while Ethan was quietly accepting the end of his marriage, Lauren was making a decision based on information that was completely wrong. She believed Ethan was still financially dependent on her. She believed he would need her help. She believed that leaving meant walking away from a difficult marriage with limited financial security. She didn't know that Ethan's life had already changed. She didn't know about the $8 billion. She didn't know about the trusts. She didn't know about the companies. She didn't know that Ethan was now receiving advice from some of the most experienced financial professionals in the country. And she certainly didn't know that the attorney who had handled Charles's estate had begun preparing documents that would eventually make the inheritance public. Then, one afternoon, Jonathan called Ethan. His voice sounded different. Ethan asked what was wrong. Jonathan said they had found the person behind the inquiries. Ethan asked who it was. Jonathan told him they weren't completely certain yet, but they had discovered a connection. A person who had recently contacted one of Charles's former business associates had also asked questions about Ethan. Ethan became silent. He asked why anyone would care about him. Jonathan said, "Because you're the heir." Ethan asked whether the person knew about the $8 billion. Jonathan answered carefully, "We don't know." That answer wasn't comforting. Ethan asked what they should do. Jonathan told him not to confront anyone, not to make calls, not to discuss the inheritance with people outside the trusted circle, and most importantly, not to assume that everyone who approached him had innocent intentions. Ethan agreed. But that evening, something happened that made the situation even more complicated. Someone left an envelope at Ethan's front door. There was no return address, no name, nothing written on the outside except Ethan's name. He stared at it for several seconds before picking it up. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Charles Mitchell standing beside a man Ethan had never seen before. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message. It contained only a few words. "Your father didn't tell you everything." Ethan stared at the photograph. His heart began beating faster. Because the man standing beside Charles wasn't a business partner Ethan recognized. He wasn't a relative. And he wasn't one of the lawyers handling the estate. Ethan immediately called Jonathan. Jonathan told him not to touch anything else. But before Jonathan could arrive, Ethan noticed something in the photograph. In the background was a building Ethan recognized. It was one of the properties listed in his father's estate. And suddenly, Ethan realized the $8 billion inheritance might contain a secret even Charles had never told him about. The fortune wasn't the only thing his father had left behind. There was something else. Something connected to the mysterious man in the photograph. Something that could explain why someone had started investigating the estate. And if Ethan discovered the truth, he might finally understand why Charles had spent his entire life hiding his wealth. But there was another problem. Lauren had just filed the first legal paperwork to begin their divorce. And she still had absolutely no idea that the man she was leaving was worth $8 billion. The moment she found out was getting closer. Much closer than Ethan realized. Ethan Mitchell couldn't stop looking at the photograph. The image was old, slightly faded around the edges, but there was no mistaking the man standing beside his father. Charles was younger in the picture, perhaps in his late 50s, and beside him stood a man Ethan had never seen before. Behind them was a large commercial building with a distinctive stone entrance. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was one of the properties listed among his father's holdings. He turned the photograph over again. The message was still there. Your father didn't tell you everything. Ethan read the words several times. Then he reached for his phone and called Jonathan Reed. Jonathan answered almost immediately. Ethan told him about the envelope. He described the photograph. For several seconds, Jonathan said nothing. Then he asked Ethan one question. Are you certain that's your father? Ethan almost became offended. Of course I'm certain. Jonathan apologized. I had to ask. Ethan sent him a photograph of the image. Jonathan told him not to leave the house and not to contact anyone connected to Charles's former businesses until he arrived. When Jonathan finally arrived, David Parker came with him. The two men studied the photograph carefully. David immediately recognized the building in the background. It was the old headquarters of one of Charles's earliest companies. But the man beside Charles was still unfamiliar. David enlarged the photograph on his computer. He examined the man's face, clothing, and position beside Charles. Then he noticed something Ethan hadn't seen. The two men weren't standing like strangers. Charles had one hand resting lightly on the man's shoulder. It looked familiar, almost like they had known each other for years. Ethan asked who he was. David said he didn't know. Jonathan looked at the back of the photograph. The handwriting appeared to be recent, but the photograph itself was decades old. That meant someone had deliberately selected an old photograph and delivered it to Ethan after Charles's death. Someone wanted Ethan to find this man. The question was why. Jonathan began searching through Charles's old business records. There were thousands of documents, contracts, partnership agreements, property purchases, corporate registrations, tax records, bank statements. Most of them were completely ordinary for someone who had built a large investment empire. But after several hours, David found something unusual. A company name appeared in records from the early years of Charles's career. The company had eventually disappeared from the public record. Its assets had been transferred into another corporation. That corporation had later been absorbed into another entity. And over the decades, the trail became increasingly difficult to follow. David told Ethan that this was how Charles had built much of his fortune. He had acquired small companies, merged them, transferred assets, reorganized ownership, and reinvested the proceeds. On paper, it looked like ordinary business activity. But one particular transaction stood out. A large property had been purchased decades earlier at a price far below its eventual value. The buyer was one of Charles's companies. The seller was another company. And the person who had authorized the sale was the mysterious man in the photograph. Ethan stared at the document. What's his name? David searched the record again. Then he found it. Richard Hale. Ethan didn't recognize the name. Neither did Jonathan. But David did. He had seen it once before. Not in the estate documents. In an old accounting file. Richard Hale had been involved with Charles during the earliest years of his business career. But according to the records, Richard had eventually disappeared from the companies. There was no clear explanation for what happened to him. His ownership interests had been transferred. His name stopped appearing. His correspondence ended. Ethan asked the obvious question. Is he dead? David searched the available records. There was no confirmed death record. That answer changed the atmosphere in the room. If Richard Hale was alive, he was potentially the only person outside Charles's inner circle who understood how the fortune had originally been created. Ethan asked Jonathan to find him. Jonathan warned him that they needed to be careful. If Richard had sent the photograph, then contacting him could reveal that Ethan had discovered the secret. But Ethan wanted answers. He told Jonathan that he had spent his entire life believing his father was one man. Now he was discovering that Charles had been another. Jonathan eventually agreed. They began searching for Richard Hale. The search took days. They found old addresses, old business records, a former office, a company registered under another name, but no current location. Then David found something. A property, a small house in Pennsylvania. The ownership records were complicated, but the name attached to the property was not Richard Hale. It belonged to a woman, Eleanor Hale. David investigated further. Eleanor was listed as Richard's wife. The property had been purchased decades earlier, and there was evidence that someone had continued paying the property taxes. Ethan asked who. David looked at the records. The payments came from an investment account connected to one of Charles's old companies. Ethan immediately understood. His father had been supporting Richard's family for years. But why? Jonathan warned Ethan that they were entering territory they didn't understand. There could be innocent explanations. Richard could have been an old friend. He could have been a former business partner. Charles might have owed him money. Or Richard could have known something about the fortune that Charles never wanted anyone else to discover. Ethan wanted to believe there was a simple explanation. But then David found another document. It was an old partnership agreement. The document showed that Richard Hale and Charles Mitchell had originally started a company together, and the ownership split was unusual. Charles owned a portion. Richard owned the rest. But years later, Richard's entire interest had been transferred to Charles. There was no ordinary sale recorded. No purchase price. No public explanation. Just a transfer. Ethan asked why Richard would give away a fortune. David said there were several possibilities. Richard could have been bought out privately. He could have been threatened. He could have been compensated through another arrangement. Or he could have voluntarily transferred everything because something had happened between the two men. Ethan looked at the photograph again. The mystery was becoming personal. He wanted to know what happened between his father and Richard. But before they could investigate further, Jonathan received a phone call. It was from one of the estate's financial institutions. A journalist had contacted them. The journalist was asking questions about Charles Mitchell. Specifically, the journalist wanted to know whether Charles had left his son an unusually large inheritance. The secret was leaking. Jonathan immediately called Ethan. Ethan asked how much the journalist knew. Jonathan said they didn't know. But the journalist had already discovered several companies connected to Charles. And if the journalist connected those companies to the trusts, the $8 billion figure could become public. Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced since the accident. Fear. Not fear of losing the money. Fear of losing his privacy. For years, Ethan had wanted people to treat him normally. Now he was about to become the heir to one of the largest private fortunes in the country. His disability had already made him feel as though strangers sometimes looked at him differently. What would happen when those strangers knew he was worth billions? Would people suddenly see a wheelchair and a fortune instead of a person? Would old acquaintances return? Would businesses pursue him? Would Lauren hear about it? That last question stayed with him. Because Lauren had already filed for divorce, and she still believed Ethan was financially ordinary. Jonathan told Ethan that they needed to prepare for the possibility that the inheritance would become public. Ethan asked whether they could stop it. Jonathan said they could protect certain details, but they couldn't guarantee complete secrecy. The estate was simply too large. Eventually, financial filings would create a public trail. Ethan understood. His private life was approaching a point of no return. Then something unexpected happened. Lauren called. Ethan hadn't heard her voice in several days. She asked how he was doing. He told her he was fine. She asked whether he had started receiving professional care. He said yes. Lauren sounded relieved. Then she said something that caught him completely off guard. I've been thinking about everything. Ethan asked what she meant. Lauren said she missed him. Ethan didn't answer immediately. She told him she regretted the way she had handled things. She said she had been overwhelmed. She said she had felt trapped. She said she didn't know whether leaving had been the right decision. Ethan listened. Then Lauren asked whether they could meet. Ethan agreed. They arranged to meet at a quiet restaurant. Lauren arrived first. When Ethan entered, she stood and looked at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then they sat down. Lauren apologized. Ethan accepted the apology. She asked him whether he was seeing anyone. He said no. She smiled slightly. Then she asked whether his financial situation had changed since Charles's death. Ethan felt his heart sink. It was a simple question, but the timing was strange. He asked why she wanted to know. Lauren said she was only curious. Ethan didn't reveal anything. Instead, he asked her whether money would change how she felt about him. Lauren looked offended. She said that wasn't fair. Ethan apologized. But inside, he was already wondering. Had she heard something? Had someone told her? Was the inheritance beginning to leak? They finished the meal without resolving anything. When Ethan returned home, Jonathan was waiting. He had more news. The journalist had published an article about Charles's business history. The article didn't mention the inheritance. Not yet. But it described Charles as a private businessman whose fortune was believed to be considerably larger than previously understood. Ethan read the article. Then he saw the photograph. It wasn't the photograph Richard had sent. It was another photograph of Charles from decades earlier. And standing beside him was the same man, Richard Hale. The article described Richard as one of Charles's earliest business partners. But it also said something else. Richard Hale had disappeared from the business world more than 20 years earlier. No one knew where he had gone. Ethan looked at Jonathan. Why would someone send me that photograph? Jonathan didn't answer. David entered the room holding another file. He looked troubled. He said they had found one more document. A private agreement between Charles Mitchell and Richard Hale. The agreement had been sealed for decades, and it contained a clause that nobody had previously known existed. If Charles died before Richard, control of a specific group of assets would transfer according to a separate arrangement. Ethan asked what assets. David slowly opened the file. The assets were not worth $8 billion. They were worth only a fraction of the fortune. But they were important, because they included the original company through which Charles had built everything else. Ethan realized that his father's fortune might have a hidden foundation, and Richard Hale might be the only person alive who knew the full story. Then Jonathan noticed something else. The agreement had been updated shortly before Charles died. Someone had changed the document, and the person who authorized the change was not Charles. It was Richard Hale. Ethan stared at the signature. The mystery had just become much bigger. Richard wasn't simply a forgotten business partner. He was alive. He had access to information about Charles's estate. He had somehow known where Ethan lived, and he had deliberately sent Ethan a photograph. But why? Was Richard trying to protect Ethan? Was he trying to expose Charles? Or was he trying to claim something that he believed Charles had taken from him? Ethan didn't know, but he knew one thing. He had to find Richard Hale before someone else did. Because the next revelation wouldn't simply explain the $8 billion fortune. It could change everything Ethan believed about his father. And somewhere, in a quiet town several states away, a man named Richard Hale was waiting. He already knew Ethan had received the photograph, and he knew exactly what Ethan was about to discover. Richard Hale had been standing outside that Pennsylvania house for several minutes when a dark sedan slowly passed the property. He watched it disappear down the road, then turned and walked back inside. He did not look frightened. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a particular moment for a very long time. On the kitchen table was a photograph of Charles Mitchell from decades earlier. Beside it sat a folder containing copies of documents that had never been included in Charles's official estate records. Richard opened the folder and looked at the first page. His hands were steady. His expression was difficult to read. Then he reached for an old telephone and made a call. The person on the other end answered after several rings. Richard said only one sentence. He found the photograph. Then he listened. Whoever was speaking to him seemed surprised. Richard's response was calm. No, it's already too late. He ended the call and stared at the photograph of Charles. For Richard Hale, the past had finally caught up with him. Back in Ethan's home, Jonathan Reed was trying to decide what they should do next. Ethan wanted to meet Richard immediately. Jonathan strongly advised against it. He explained that they didn't know why Richard had sent the photograph. They didn't know what he wanted. They didn't even know whether the message had been intended as a warning or an invitation. Ethan said he didn't care. He had spent too many years accepting unanswered questions about his father. First there had been the secret fortune, then the hidden companies. Now there was a man who had apparently been connected to Charles for decades and had somehow disappeared from his life. Ethan wanted the truth. Jonathan told him the truth could come with consequences. Ethan looked at him and said, I've already lost my marriage. I've already lost the life I thought I was going to have. I'm not going to spend the rest of it being afraid of what my father kept from me. Jonathan knew there was no changing his mind. They would find Richard Hale. The next morning, David Parker began tracing the property records connected to Richard's family. The more he searched, the stranger the story became. Richard hadn't simply vanished from Charles's business world. He had apparently withdrawn from almost everything. His name appeared in very few financial records after a certain point. There were no major purchases, no corporate positions, no public business activity. Yet his household expenses had been quietly covered through a series of payments connected to companies Charles controlled. David followed those payments backward and discovered that they had continued for more than 20 years. Ethan couldn't understand it. If Charles had betrayed Richard, why would he continue supporting him? If Richard had voluntarily walked away, why would Charles continue sending money? And if the two men had remained friends, why had Charles never mentioned him to Ethan? Every answer seemed to create another question. Then David discovered something even more unusual. The payments weren't being sent directly to Richard. They were being routed through a charitable foundation. On paper, the money appeared to support a private family assistance program. But there was almost no public information about the foundation. Ethan asked Jonathan whether his father had ever mentioned the foundation. Jonathan shook his head. He had worked with Charles for years, but even he had never heard the name. David said that was impossible. The foundation had received millions of dollars over the years, yet it appeared to have almost no public activity. Ethan asked where the money went. David said most of it eventually reached accounts connected to Richard Hale's family. That was when Ethan began to wonder whether his father's secret had never really been about money. Maybe the money was simply the trail. Maybe the real secret was what Charles had been trying to protect. Jonathan told him they needed to examine the original company records before drawing conclusions. They went through the oldest documents they could locate. Most were ordinary, but one file contained a letter written by Charles more than 30 years earlier. The letter was addressed to Richard. It was short. Charles wrote that there were things he could never explain publicly. He said that if anything happened to him, Richard should make sure certain people were protected. He never identified those people by name. Ethan read the letter twice. Then he asked Jonathan what it meant. Jonathan said they needed to know when it had been written. David checked the date. It was written shortly after the first major expansion of Charles's fortune. Ethan suddenly remembered something from his childhood. His father had once told him that there had been a period in his life when everything nearly collapsed. Ethan had always assumed Charles was talking about a business failure, but perhaps that wasn't what he meant. Perhaps something had happened that had nothing to do with business. Ethan asked David to search for any unusual events around that period. David found several property transfers. Then he found a company that had been dissolved unexpectedly. Then another. The pattern suggested that Charles had moved assets rapidly from one business structure to another. It looked like someone preparing for a threat. Jonathan warned Ethan that they still didn't know what the threat had been. But there was one way to find out. They needed Richard. 2 days later, Ethan, Jonathan, and David drove to Pennsylvania. Ethan had insisted on going himself. He didn't want Richard speaking to anyone else first. The journey was quiet. Ethan spent much of the drive staring through the window. He wasn't thinking about the money anymore. He was thinking about his father. Charles had died without telling him the truth. Whatever Richard knew, Ethan wanted to hear it directly. When they finally reached the small Pennsylvania town, they didn't immediately go to Richard's house. Jonathan wanted to make sure no one was watching them. They parked several streets away and waited. Nothing appeared unusual. The neighborhood was quiet. Ordinary houses lined the road. Children played in a distant yard. An elderly couple walked their dog. Nothing about the area suggested that one of its residents might hold information connected to an $8 billion fortune. Eventually, Ethan arrived at Richard's house. He stopped outside the front door. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. Jonathan reminded him that they could leave. Ethan shook his head. Then he knocked. Nothing happened. He knocked again. A few seconds later, the door opened. Richard Hale stood there. Ethan immediately recognized him from the photograph. For the first time, the mystery had a face. Richard looked at Ethan for several seconds without speaking. His eyes moved toward the wheelchair, then back to Ethan's face. There was something in his expression that Ethan couldn't understand. Then Richard said, "You look like your father." Ethan felt a chill run through him. He asked whether Richard had known Charles well. Richard answered, "Better than most people." Jonathan introduced himself. Richard didn't seem surprised. He stepped aside and invited them inside. The house was modest. There were no signs of extraordinary wealth. Old books lined the walls. Family photographs stood on shelves. A worn wooden table occupied the center of the living room. On one wall hung a photograph of a younger Richard standing beside a much younger Charles. Ethan stared at it. Richard noticed. He said, "That was before everything changed." Ethan asked what happened. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the kitchen and returned carrying a small wooden box. He placed it on the table. Then he looked at Ethan. "Your father wanted you to have this." Ethan stared at the box. He asked why Charles hadn't given it to him himself. Richard's expression changed. Because he knew he wouldn't get the chance. The room became silent. Ethan asked what Richard meant. Richard said Charles knew he was running out of time. Ethan remembered his father's final months. Charles had never told him that he was seriously ill. He had simply said that he had business matters to settle. Ethan had assumed that was normal for a man like Charles. But Richard was suggesting something else. He was suggesting that Charles had known his death was coming. Ethan asked whether his father had been afraid. Richard said, Charles wasn't afraid of dying. Then he paused. He was afraid of what would happen after he died. Richard opened the wooden box. Inside was a collection of handwritten letters, photographs, and old financial documents. Ethan looked at them. Then he saw a photograph of himself as a child. He had never seen it before. He was standing beside Charles outside an unfamiliar house. Richard said the house belonged to someone important. Ethan asked who. Richard didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out another photograph. This one showed Charles standing beside a young woman. Ethan stared at the image. He didn't recognize her. Richard watched his face. Then he said, "Your father never told you about her, did he?" Ethan slowly shook his head. Jonathan asked who the woman was. Richard looked directly at Ethan. Her name was Emily. Ethan asked why she mattered. Richard said, "Because she was the reason your father built the fortune the way he did." Ethan couldn't understand. He asked what Richard meant. Richard told him that the story Ethan had heard about Charles was incomplete. Charles hadn't simply become wealthy through investments. He had spent decades building a financial structure designed to protect several people from a threat that Richard said had once been very real. Ethan asked what threat. Richard leaned back in his chair. "Your father made enemies." Jonathan asked what kind of enemies. Richard said, "The kind that don't threaten you with words." He stopped there. Ethan asked whether Charles had been involved in anything illegal. Richard immediately shook his head. No. Then he added something that made Ethan even more confused. "Your father spent his life trying to make sure he never became the kind of man they wanted him to become." Ethan asked who they were. Richard looked toward the window. He said the people Charles had crossed paths with decades ago were no longer officially connected to him. But some relationships never truly disappeared. Richard then revealed something Ethan had never heard before. Charles had created the first major company with Richard not because he wanted to become rich. He wanted leverage, financial independence, a way to protect people without asking anyone else for permission. Ethan asked who he was protecting. Richard looked at him. "You." Ethan froze. Richard explained that when Ethan was young, Charles became increasingly concerned that someone might use his family against him. He created layers of companies and trusts so that no single person could easily determine what he owned. Over time, those structures became enormously valuable. What began as protection eventually became an $8 billion empire. Ethan asked why Charles had never told him. Richard said Charles wanted Ethan to have a normal childhood. He didn't want you growing up knowing that every person who smiled at you might have a reason. Ethan lowered his eyes. For the first time, the fortune didn't feel like a gift. It felt like evidence. Evidence of a life his father had kept hidden. Then Richard said something Ethan wasn't prepared to hear. "Your father didn't leave you $8 billion because he wanted you to become rich." Ethan looked at him. Richard continued. "He left it to you because he believed you were the only person he could trust with what came next." Ethan asked what came next meant. Richard didn't answer. Instead, he handed Ethan one of the letters. The handwriting was Charles's. Ethan recognized it immediately. The letter was addressed to him. Not to Richard. Not to Jonathan. To Ethan. His hands began to shake as he unfolded it. The letter was dated several months before Charles died. Ethan read the first few lines. Then he stopped. His face changed. Jonathan asked what was wrong. Ethan didn't answer. He kept reading. Finally, he looked up. His voice was barely audible. "My father knew Lauren would leave me." Jonathan and David looked at each other. Richard remained completely still. Ethan asked Richard how Charles could have known. Richard said Charles didn't know Lauren would leave specifically, But Charles knew that people sometimes abandoned those who became vulnerable. Ethan looked back at the letter. There was another sentence. A sentence that would change everything. Charles had written that if Ethan ever found himself alone, he should not immediately assume that the people who left him were his enemies. Sometimes, Charles wrote, people leave because they cannot carry the weight of another person's life. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. For a moment, the billionaire inheritance disappeared from his mind. He wasn't thinking about companies. He wasn't thinking about trusts. He was thinking about his father. A father who had apparently understood his son's future better than Ethan had ever realized. Then Ethan reached the final page. There were only a few lines, and they contained a warning. Charles wrote that there was one person Ethan must never trust. The person's name had been removed from the letter, not crossed out, cut away. Someone had physically removed the section containing the name. Ethan looked at Richard. Who took it? Richard didn't answer. Ethan asked again. Richard finally said, I did. Jonathan stood up. Why? Richard looked at Ethan. Because if you knew that name before you were ready, you might have gone looking for him. Ethan asked what Richard meant. Richard said the person Charles feared was still alive. And now that Ethan had inherited the fortune, that person would have a reason to find him. The room fell silent. Ethan asked Richard whether this was the reason he had sent the photograph. Richard nodded. He said he needed Ethan to understand that his father's past was no longer buried. Ethan asked what he was supposed to do. Richard looked directly into his eyes. Prepare yourself. Then Richard reached into the wooden box one final time. He removed a second photograph. This one was much newer. It showed a man standing outside a building. Ethan recognized the man immediately. It was someone he had seen before. Someone connected to his father's estate. Someone who had recently been asking questions about him. Ethan looked at Richard. Richard said, He's already looking for you. And suddenly, Ethan understood. The inheritance had not attracted the danger. The inheritance had revealed where Ethan was. Someone had been waiting for Charles to die. Someone had been waiting for control of the fortune to pass to Ethan. And now that Ethan had begun asking questions, that person knew the new heir was no longer willing to remain in the dark. Richard looked at the photograph and quietly said, Your father spent 30 years keeping you safe. He looked back at Ethan. Now it's your turn to find out why. And for the first time, Ethan understood that the $8 billion inheritance was not the end of his father's secret. It was the beginning. For 30 years, Charles Mitchell had built an empire that almost nobody understood. To the outside world, he was a brilliant businessman who had accumulated wealth through investments, real estate, and private companies. To his son Ethan, he was simply his father. A demanding man at times, a distant man at others, but still the man who had taught him how to ride a bicycle, how to shake someone's hand, and how to keep his word. Ethan had never imagined that beneath that ordinary image was a financial empire worth approximately $8 billion, a network of companies created over decades, and a secret history involving a man named Richard Hale. But now Ethan was sitting in Richard's Pennsylvania home, staring at a letter from his dead father with a piece of the page deliberately removed. The missing name represented the final question. Who was Charles so afraid of? And why had Richard spent decades protecting Ethan from the answer? Richard finally told him that the man they were looking for wasn't a stranger. He was someone Charles had once trusted. The room went completely quiet after Richard said those words. Ethan looked at the photograph lying on the table. It showed a man outside a modern office building, his face partly turned away from the camera. Ethan asked Richard how he knew this man was looking for him. Richard said because the same person had been asking questions about Charles for years. He had contacted former employees, former business partners, and people connected to the Mitchell family. But there was something Richard had not told Ethan. The man had also tried to locate the original records showing how Charles acquired his first major fortune. Ethan asked why those records mattered. Richard explained that the $8 billion fortune was built on one transaction that occurred more than 30 years earlier. A transaction that had created enormous value almost overnight. But there was a problem. Charles had not been the only person entitled to that value. Richard had been involved. Another person had been involved. And when that person's interests disappeared from the records, Charles became the sole controller of the company. Ethan asked the question he had been avoiding since he entered the house. Did my father steal the fortune? Richard looked at him for several seconds before answering. No, Richard explained that Charles had never stolen the money. But he had made a decision that changed several lives. Years earlier, Charles, Richard and a third man named Victor Grant had created a small investment company. They were young, ambitious, and convinced they could build something significant. Victor was the financial strategist. Richard understood property and operations. Charles understood people. Together, they acquired distressed properties and businesses that larger investors had ignored. One particular property became the foundation of their future wealth. The property looked worthless at the time. It was an old industrial site that had been abandoned after years of financial trouble. But Charles had discovered something that nobody else understood. The land underneath it was far more valuable than the company owning it realized. If they could acquire the property and eventually redevelop it, the potential value could reach hundreds of millions of dollars. The three partners agreed to purchase it together. Richard said the plan was simple. They would invest their savings, take on debt, renovate the property, and sell it when the market improved. But Victor wanted something different. He wanted to move faster. He believed the property could become the foundation for an even larger empire. Charles disagreed. Richard tried to keep the partnership together. Then Victor discovered that the property was connected to a larger development project that could make the partners enormously wealthy. He wanted to sell immediately. Charles refused. That disagreement became the first major fracture between the three men. Then something happened that changed everything. Victor disappeared from the partnership records. His ownership interest was transferred. The company continued without him. Charles eventually became the controlling shareholder. Richard remained involved for several years, but his role slowly diminished. Ethan asked why Victor would simply give up his stake in a company that would eventually become worth billions. Richard said he didn't. That's the part your father spent 30 years trying to hide. Ethan stared at him. Richard explained that Victor had not willingly abandoned his ownership. He had signed the documents after receiving information that could have destroyed him financially and personally. Charles knew Victor had committed serious financial misconduct before the partnership. If the information became public, Victor could have faced prosecution and lost everything. Charles gave him a choice. He could cooperate and surrender his interests, or Charles could expose everything. Richard admitted that Charles believed he was protecting the company. But Richard never agreed with the decision. He thought Charles had crossed a line. Charles insisted that Victor had created the danger himself. The disagreement eventually destroyed the friendship between Charles and Richard. Richard walked away from the company. But Charles continued sending money to Richard's family because he believed he owed Richard for the years they had worked together. That explained the mysterious payments. It explained the foundation. It explained why Richard had remained financially connected to Charles without appearing publicly connected to him. But it didn't explain the $8 billion. Richard told Ethan that the original investment had grown through decades of reinvestment. Properties were sold. Profits were moved into new companies. New businesses were acquired. Each success created another opportunity. Charles became extremely wealthy, but he never forgot how the empire began. He created trusts and holding companies designed to prevent the fortune from being easily dismantled. Ethan had assumed those structures existed simply for tax and investment purposes. They didn't. They were designed to protect the money from anyone who might eventually challenge Charles's ownership. Richard said Charles always believed someone would eventually come after the fortune. Ethan asked whether that person was Victor. Richard shook his head. Victor was dead. He had died several years earlier. The man in the photograph was Victor's son, Michael Grant. He had spent years trying to determine whether his father had been cheated out of his fortune. And now Ethan understood why the estate had attracted attention. Michael believed the $8 billion fortune belonged partly to his family. Richard told Ethan there was more. Victor had left behind evidence. Evidence that could potentially challenge the ownership structure. That evidence was the reason Charles had been so careful. And it was the reason Richard had removed the name from the letter. Ethan asked whether Michael had proof. Richard said yes, but he didn't know where it was. For decades, Victor had kept copies of the original partnership documents. Those documents could reveal exactly how ownership had been transferred. If Michael found them, he could potentially create a legal battle that would last for years. Ethan asked whether the fortune could actually be taken from him. Jonathan Reed, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. He explained that an inheritance of this size could face legal challenges even without a hidden partnership dispute. But if someone produced credible evidence that the original ownership transfer had been fraudulent or coerced, the situation could become extremely complicated. Ethan looked down at his hands. He had spent his entire life believing wealth meant security. Now he understood that wealth could also create enemies. Jonathan then revealed something else. The estate attorneys had already received a letter. The letter came from Michael Grant. It demanded access to historical corporate records. It also claimed that Charles Mitchell had concealed evidence concerning Victor Grant's ownership. Ethan asked when the letter arrived. Jonathan said it had arrived 3 days before Lauren called him. Ethan suddenly remembered Lauren asking about his financial situation. He looked at Jonathan. "Do you think she knew?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He said they couldn't accuse Lauren without evidence. But Ethan remembered the timing. Lauren had left him when his health deteriorated. Then, shortly after Charles died, she called. And now she was asking about his finances. Ethan felt something inside him harden. He needed to know whether Lauren had been contacted by Michael. They called her. Lauren answered. Ethan asked whether she knew anyone named Michael Grant. There was a long silence. Too long. Then Lauren asked why he was asking. Ethan said, "Because I think you know more than you're telling me." Lauren began crying. She admitted that someone had contacted her. She said the person claimed to know about Charles's fortune. He told her Ethan was going to inherit billions. Lauren said she didn't believe him at first, but then he showed her documents. She became frightened. Ethan asked what the man wanted. Lauren said he wanted information about Ethan's family. He wanted to know what Charles had told Ethan. He wanted to know whether Ethan had access to certain records. And he wanted to know whether Ethan was still emotionally vulnerable after the accident. Ethan couldn't speak. Lauren apologized. She said she had made a terrible mistake. She admitted that part of her decision to leave Ethan had been influenced by fear, but she insisted that she had never intended to help anyone hurt him. Ethan asked the question that had been sitting inside him for months. "Did you leave me because I became disabled?" Lauren cried. She said yes. Not because she hated him, not because she stopped caring, but because she couldn't accept the life they were suddenly facing. Ethan listened quietly. For the first time, Lauren didn't try to defend herself. She admitted that she had been selfish. She admitted that she had chosen the easier life. And she admitted that if she had known Ethan was going to inherit billions, she probably would have made a different decision. That final confession hurt more than Ethan expected, because it answered something money never could. Lauren hadn't left because Ethan wasn't worth loving. She had left because she wasn't strong enough to stay. Ethan forgave her, but he didn't take her back. He told her that some decisions change a relationship permanently. Then he ended the call. Jonathan sat quietly beside him. Richard watched from across the room. Ethan asked him what his father would have done. Richard smiled sadly. "He would have protected you." Ethan looked at him. Richard continued, "But your father made one mistake." "What mistake?" "He thought protecting you meant keeping the truth away from you." Richard handed Ethan the final document. It was the original partnership agreement. The document showed that Victor had indeed owned a substantial portion of the company. But there was another page. A page that changed everything. Victor had voluntarily transferred his ownership. Not because Charles threatened him. Not because Charles forced him. Because Victor had secretly been moving company money into accounts controlled by people outside the partnership. He had been preparing to steal the entire company. Charles discovered the scheme. Richard discovered it too. Victor had been given a choice. Leave quietly and surrender his ownership, or face criminal charges. Victor chose to leave. The document contained his signature. The entire legal mystery had been built around a lie. Michael Grant believed his father had been robbed. But Victor had known exactly what he was doing. Ethan looked at Richard. "Why didn't my father tell everyone?" Richard said because Charles knew Victor's family would eventually suffer from the truth. Victor had a wife. He had children. Charles didn't want them destroyed by their father's actions. So Charles kept quiet. He protected the family of the man who had tried to betray him. That was the secret behind the fortune. Not murder. Not theft. Not some hidden criminal empire. A decision made decades earlier by a man who believed he could control the consequences of keeping someone else's secret. And that decision had followed him for the rest of his life. But there was still one problem. Michael Grant had already made his accusations public. The media had begun reporting on the dispute. Financial journalists were asking questions. People wanted to know why an unknown heir had suddenly inherited a fortune worth billions. They wanted to know who Charles Mitchell really was. Ethan's private life was disappearing. Then the legal battle began. Michael's attorneys filed their claims. Jonathan responded with the original partnership agreement. The signatures were examined. The financial records were reviewed. Independent investigators reconstructed the transactions. And eventually, the evidence became clear. Victor had voluntarily transferred his ownership. There had been no theft, no fraudulent transfer, no secret criminal scheme. The $8 billion fortune belonged to Charles. And after his death, it legally belonged to Ethan. Michael's case collapsed. But Ethan didn't celebrate. Because there was one final document left. The letter Charles had written to him. The part Richard had protected for years. Richard finally gave Ethan the missing piece. It contained only one sentence. Give away enough of what I built that it can no longer control you. Ethan read it again. Then again. His father had spent 30 years building wealth. And in the end, he didn't want his son to worship it. He wanted him to be free from it. Months later, Ethan made his first major decision as the heir to the fortune. He established a foundation dedicated to helping people living with catastrophic injuries and disabilities. He funded rehabilitation centers. He supported caregivers. He created programs that helped families remain together when medical bills threatened to destroy them. And he did something else. He established a private fund for spouses and family members who suddenly found themselves caring for disabled loved ones. Ethan never forgot Lauren. He never publicly attacked her. He never told the world what had happened inside their marriage. When reporters asked about his divorce, he simply said that sometimes two people can love each other and still discover that they cannot walk the same road. Richard Hale remained in Pennsylvania. Ethan visited him regularly. The two men eventually became close. Richard told Ethan stories about Charles that nobody else knew. He told him about the first company, the first major property, the first million, the first mistake, the first time Charles realized he might become extraordinarily wealthy. And he told Ethan about the man Charles had been before the money, a young man who believed that success meant being able to protect the people he loved. Ethan eventually understood that his father had spent his life trying to protect him from a world that Charles knew could be cruel. But Charles had made one final mistake. He believed silence was protection. It wasn't. Silence had left Ethan vulnerable to confusion, loneliness, and betrayal. The truth had hurt, but the truth had also set him free. As for Michael Grant, he disappeared from the headlines after the legal case collapsed. He never apologized publicly. He never admitted that his father's story had been wrong. But he stopped pursuing the fortune. The case was over. The mystery was finally solved. Yet Ethan kept one photograph. It was the first photograph Richard had sent him. Charles stood beside Richard outside the old company headquarters. Two young businessmen at the beginning of everything. Ethan kept the photograph on his desk. Not because it reminded him of billions. Because it reminded him that every fortune has a story. And sometimes the story behind the money matters more than the money itself. There was also one final thing Ethan learned. The greatest inheritance his father left him wasn't $8 billion. It was the understanding that money cannot make someone stay. Money cannot make someone loyal. Money cannot make someone love you. And money certainly cannot repair the damage caused when people choose to walk away. Lauren had left Ethan when his life changed. She returned when she learned how much he was worth. And that taught him something he could never have learned from a financial advisor. Sometimes losing someone is the price of discovering who they really are. And sometimes the person who walks away from you is not the person who destroys you. Sometimes their departure forces you to discover the person you were always capable of becoming. Years later, Ethan was asked during an interview what he remembered most about inheriting billions of dollars. The interviewer probably expected him to talk about the money. Instead, Ethan talked about the day his wife left. He said that before his father's fortune became public, he had believed his life was over. He had lost his health. He had lost his marriage. He had lost the future he had imagined. Then he discovered that his father had left him $8 billion. For a while, he thought that money had saved him. But eventually he realized something different. The money hadn't saved him. The truth had. Because once he knew the truth, he stopped begging people to stay. He stopped measuring his worth by what someone else was willing to give him. And he stopped believing that being abandoned meant being worthless. Then he said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. If someone leaves you when you're at your weakest, don't spend the rest of your life trying to prove that they made a mistake. Build a life so meaningful that their decision no longer defines you. That became the sentence Ethan carried with him. The $8 billion fortune changed his circumstances, but the betrayal changed his understanding of people. And his father's secret changed his understanding of himself. The woman who abandoned him never realized what Charles had left behind. The man she walked away from wasn't simply an injured husband. He was the heir to an empire. But even that wasn't the greatest twist. Because when Ethan finally had everything money could buy, the one thing he valued most couldn't be purchased: trust. And once trust is broken, no fortune in the world can simply buy it back. So perhaps the real question isn't whether Lauren regretted leaving Ethan after discovering his fortune. The real question is whether Ethan would have become the man he eventually became if she had stayed. Maybe the loss was part of the transformation. Maybe the betrayal forced him to look beyond money, beyond his father's shadow, and beyond the life he thought he had lost. And perhaps that's the lesson hidden inside this entire story. We spend so much of our lives fearing what we'll lose: a relationship, a career, a home, a future. But sometimes what feels like the end is simply the moment when the life you were supposed to live finally begins. Ethan lost his marriage. He lost the illusion that his father had told him everything. He lost the belief that wealth automatically creates security. But he gained something far more valuable. He gained the truth. He gained independence. He gained purpose. And eventually, he gained the ability to look back at the man who had abandoned him without needing revenge. Because revenge would have kept him tied to the past. Forgiveness allowed him to walk forward. And that brings us back to the photograph. Charles Mitchell standing beside Richard Hale. Two men at the beginning of a fortune nobody could have imagined. Behind them was an empty building. In front of them was a future neither could see. 30 years later, that fortune would be worth $8 billion. One man would die. Another would disappear. A marriage would collapse. A secret would surface. And a disabled man whom his wife believed had become helpless would eventually discover that he was sitting on one of the largest fortunes in the country. But the money wasn't what made his story extraordinary. It was what he chose to do with it. Because Ethan could have used the fortune to punish everyone who had hurt him. Instead, he used it to help people who were facing the same kind of life-changing circumstances he had once faced. And perhaps that was the final gift Charles Mitchell had actually intended to leave his son. Not $8 billion. Not companies. Not properties. Not investments. A choice. A choice to become bitter or become better. A choice to use pain as an excuse or use it as a reason to help someone else. A choice to let the people who abandoned him define his future or to build a future they could never take away. And Ethan chose the second. So if you were in Ethan's position, what would you have done? Would you have forgiven Lauren after discovering the truth? Would you have allowed her back into your life? Or would you have closed that chapter forever? And if you discovered that your father had secretly built an $8 billion fortune and deliberately hidden it from you, would you want to know every detail of how he made it? Tell us what you think in the comments. Because sometimes the most difficult part of inheriting a fortune isn't learning how much money you have. It's discovering what the people closest to you were willing to do when they thought you had nothing. And before we dive deeper into our next story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the next story we're about to tell you proves something Ethan Mitchell learned the hard way. You never really know who will stay when you have nothing until you have something to lose.